Greetings all and welcome. So I'm doing another conversation today, and today I'm joined by Sean Berube. Excuse me, Berube. Is that right?
All of them are right. Berube, any's fine.
Right. Okay. I just asked him about this, so it's kind of embarrassing that I didn't quite nail it that first time. But in any case, I've already pointed out that I don't have the best memory in the world. So, anyway, I found Sean some time ago on X, and I started following his stuff there. Sean has a YouTube channel, which is just filled with some great videos about philosophy and some thoughts about our contemporary situation, the modern crisis, and things of that sort. And I definitely didn't want to miss the opportunity of having him on for a conversation. And so we're going to be talking about a number of different things, some light stuff like the modern crisis and meaning and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and things of that sort. We're just going to see where the conversation takes us. Before anything, Sean, why don't you just tell us a word about yourself? Give us some introductory statements. Who are you? What do you do?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. I always feel like I'm terrible just explaining myself, but to give some like high-level information that might be relevant to this conversation. For one, I've been a novelist for about 10 years, and as far as vocation, that's my what I'm orienting my life around is building a platform, particularly around trying to solve the meaning crisis, and ideally writing novels that can touch people and sort of awaken them to a meaning crisis. Very briefly, biographically speaking, I suffered a lot with a lot of existential angst in my late teens to early 20s. It was literature and then eventually philosophy and theology that sort of answered those problems and got me to a much healthier state of mind and a much healthier connection with reality. And ever since then, I've essentially just wanted to be a patron spreading the good word of books, literature, and philosophy. Everything true, good, and beautiful. Yeah, no, I've been doing a YouTube channel for 2 years and relatively new to X, and basically just love going online, having conversations to talk about these true, good, and beautiful things. That's maybe a quick high level.
Sounds great, Sean. That's perfect. Yeah, the true good and the beautiful are certainly subjects that never get old, and there aren't enough people talking about them nowadays, I feel. So I'm very happy to see somebody out there who's fighting the good fight for that. All right, so to get into this, Sean, I think that we're going to begin by talking a little bit about Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. There's something very interesting that happened with Dostoevsky and Nietzsche insofar as they seem to have traveled a lot of the same ground as one another. You've done videos on both of these individuals. I know that you're a big fan of Dostoevsky and that you've read a lot of his work and that you've done a number of excellent videos on some of his books. And I recently saw a video of yours also on Nietzsche in which you very competently summarized his philosophy in a very brief amount of time, which is not an easy thing to do without making all kinds of preposterous claims. Most people who try to do that usually do, but yours was a very, very fine video. So I want to compliment you on that. Now, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche lived around the same time, and it's a bit unclear as to whether or not Nietzsche had ever heard of Dostoevsky. I don't believe there is any indication that Dostoevsky knew of Nietzsche's existence. They cover many of the same issues, but from very different points of view. And that makes them very, very interesting because they're profound critics of similar problems on two different parts of, let's say, the Eurosphere, if we will. And they come at these problems, again, from radically different perspectives. And it seems to me like there was something that really could have happened there, a great historical moment, if they'd found one another and responded to one another. But that never actually transpired. In one of your videos, though, Sean, you point to an interesting parallel between Nietzsche and Raskolnikov, the character of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, which is, of course, one of Dostoevsky's major and most famous works. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the parallel that you see there and how that might shed light on either of these authors.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, so I guess when you're specifically discussing Raskolnikov and Nietzsche, again with Nietzsche, one as you pointed out before, it's really difficult to actually pinpoint his philosophy just because there's so much going on with him, and sometimes he's knowingly contradicting himself. But I think like one of the easiest ways to pin him down, at least as a starting point, is his will to power. Right, like Nietzsche essentially emphasized that power goes above truth. And he was really the first significant philosopher to ever make such a claim and build a philosophy upon that. And so, as far as will to power, what he essentially was saying is a good life is to try to be a Ubermensch, right? Be great, be powerful, and enforce your will. And likewise, I believe he discusses this in Beyond Good and Evil that morality is largely slave morality, or a sort of construct that needs to be overcome as a byproduct of Christianity and Socratic thought over 2,000 years. Um, So Raskolnikov, in a sense, I've always seen him as sort of a Nietzschean figure insofar as he tries to actually act out Nietzsche's claim. Because in Crime and Punishment, I mean, I guess this isn't a spoiler since you know what happens in the first 100 pages. It's murder, right? He plans to murder someone, and he says, if I do this murder, it will help so many people, and it's this really, like, horrible lady. No one's going to miss her. It's doing the world a favor. And this would go against the natural moral law, at least insofar as, say, Dostoevsky or Christianity would be concerned with, thou shalt not murder. And so essentially what Raskolnikov is trying to do here is he's trying to assert his power and assert a sort of liberation away from this slave morality and create a better future based off of his own views on a powerful life and what is good in his own eyes. And as he tries to do that, as he usurps the natural moral order, we just see this mental denigration and deterioration consequently throughout the book. And you don't want to speculate too much as far as Nietzsche and his life goes, but biographically speaking, he also had bouts of insanity for the last, I want to say 10 to 12 years of his life and was in a mental institution. A lot of that was absolutely brought on by syphilis, but there's also good reason to believe that he was also made a victim to his own philosophy, insofar as his trying to assert and grasp power was just conflicting with the natural moral order and drove him to insanity. And that's like the very quick high-level connections I would see between those two characters.
There's some really interesting parallels there. It does occur to me that, in a certain way, Raskolnikov is like an artistic hypothesis. What would happen if you tried to actually apply this kind of a philosophy? What would the effects of that be? Not just in terms of the way that you live your life, but in terms of your internal being, because that's where Dostoevsky really shines, is in that kind of internal psychology of his characters, bringing out the way that they actually experience these things. And I think that, of course, as you say, it's necessary to tread a little bit lightly around the questions of Nietzsche's particular sickness and to what extent it was connected to his philosophy. But if we're going to take Nietzsche's own thought seriously, every philosophy is the autobiography of the philosopher. Um, and I think that just seeing the way in which his particular deterioration happened, it's very difficult to avoid the impression that his ideas were pushing him decidedly in that direction, or that perhaps we could say the form of the illness, the way that the illness actually manifested in him, was connected intimately to the way that he perceived the world and the way that he philosophized. Now, in your video, you make an interesting point that Raskolnikov undergoes this process, this crisis, this kind of interior deterioration, and he does go crazy, but he comes back out of it. There's a kind of very, I think, fundamentally Christian sort of redemption that happens at the end for Raskolnikov. And Nietzsche, at least insofar as his life goes, was not so fortunate because, as you point out, he spent the last 10 years of his life in an insane asylum, and probably 5 to 10 years before that, deteriorating into insanity. So the question, I guess, that I pose then is how you would see the redemptive part of Dostoevsky's work playing in this kind of a comparison. Like, what does the redemption show us? The redemption of Raskolnikov.
Absolutely. Um, I would say a lot of this and a lot of the redemption that does show up time and time again through Dostoevsky's works is, I mean, it's fairly straightforward. It's Christianity, and I know he was particularly a Russian Orthodox, and that played a big part of his later life. Speaking strictly of Dostoevsky, I believe he was much more of a left-leaning revolutionary through most of his earlier life, and that's what got him into trouble with the government, and nearly had his near-death experience with his fake execution. And I think it was that sort of existential horror that made him start to, well, I mean, that kind of informed the rest of his life. But, in my opinion, what that did was that led him to realize the sort of necessity of hierarchy, that there's, as he had this sort of out-of-body, out-of-death experience, what seemed to haunt him for the rest of his life is that there's something way beyond me. There's some sort of great grand mystery to the cosmos and the universe. And he found his answers in, again, Christianity. So I think what that speaks to above everything else is that hierarchy is not only a necessity, but is necessary to a happy life. The whole idea of the Nietzschean will to power man is that he is trying to be his own God. I'm going to make my own ways of being. I'm going to create my own values and my own sense of morality, and I'm going to be entirely self-defined how I would see it. And again, you see the fruits of that, as we just said, through both Raskolnikov and um, Nietzsche. Whereas I think what you would ultimately say the inversion is with Dostoevsky, as far as where you find these moments of salvation and his otherwise dark corpuses of literature, is it's the opposite of trying to assert power. It's like exalting oneself by humbling oneself. With Raskolnikov, a big part of his transformation isn't just a blind acceptance of dogma, but it's much more of a like a realization of the limitations of his own ways and accepting that limitation and submitting himself in humility, like a sort of surrender of I give up, I give myself up to you. And he lowers himself but learns to look up. And I think it's that posture of making yourself less but looking up and exalting that which is greater than you that starts to bring about that sense of peace and, psychological cohesiveness.
Definitely, definitely. Peace is one of those things that I think Nietzsche always particularly shunned, right? I mean, he certainly has respect for a kind of coherency of character and a kind of ability to keep one's head amidst all the battles of life and things like that, and a certain warrior-like attitude toward life. But peace, as such, I think, is something that he fairly consistently denigrates, and it's that's interesting. I mean, I wonder to what extent that denigration of peace plays into this question of his philosophical and psychological breakdown. It occurs to me as you were speaking, I don't know, I'd never seen this before, but there actually is another very fascinating parallel between the lives of Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, insofar as Nietzsche also had what one could call a near death experience early in his life. Nietzsche's father had died very young, and as Nietzsche was approaching the same point in his own life, he was assailed by a number of very grievous ailments and believed that he was on the verge of the grave. So he prepared his will and things like that, and he was entirely ready to just call it quits and to leave this life. This was before he'd written any of his major works, and he came back from that, of course, and was haunted by a kind of gratitude for the life that had been given to him again. But the contrast between the way that he treated that gift and the way that Dostoevsky treated that gift, and the presence in Dostoevsky of a kind of gratitude toward divine grace, which is, if not lacking in Nietzsche, at least expresses itself in a radically different way. That's a very interesting contrast as well. I mean, I'm always curious about this. To what extent are we dealing with just differences in character here? To what extent are we dealing with philosophical differences? What is it that establishes a person's relationship toward these events and the way that one interprets them?
That's something that, as a general question, that always has intrigued me as well, just insofar as how anyone, you could even just say this more universally, how anyone reacts to difficult experiences. Insofar as, like, I was raised up in the same household with three other siblings, and I had a particular experience. I wouldn't say it's overly traumatic, but it was very significant into my own life insofar as it made me radically reoriented all of my views in terms of how I conceptualized and understood reality, and made me just change my entire life course. And my three siblings who were in the similar environment basically were subjected to that same environment, and they just it didn't have an impact on them, if that makes sense. And I know I'm speaking a little abstractly because I don't want to dive too much into the biographical details of my life now, but what we're discussing here is, at the highest level, a sort of relation to that which is above you, right? And I think what a lot of that comes down to in terms of whether this has what sort of transformation it has on you is how curious are you. A lot of people who aren't profoundly moved, I think, are not. I think the word I'm looking for is they're assured, right? They're like they are certain. They don't think that they need any more answers, and so this might be straying a bit from strictly Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, especially because I don't feel particularly an authority on Nietzsche, but I find that if there's a lack of curiosity or a dogmatic set of conviction in one's beliefs and principles, then there seems to be less of an openness to discovery and therefore less of a chance of transformation. Does that sort of make sense?
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think so to move this a little bit now into kind of focusing more on our contemporary situation, because I think that both of these authors have a great deal to tell us about our contemporary situation. And one of the things I appreciated about your video on Nietzsche was how insistent you were about how important he was for the progress of modern philosophy. I think that probably he was the key figure, certainly of the last 300 years in modern philosophy, and perhaps the key philosopher of modernity as such, with very few other names that one could broach alongside his. Let me approach it this way: the Christian view on this, on suffering and on death, is that these things are given to us as gifts. They're given to us as ways of bringing us into a greater awareness of our nature, our existence, and the contingency of our existence here on earth. That if we hadn't been given suffering and death by God, consequent to the fall, then we would essentially be in the same state as the demons. We would be immortal, we would be able to do anything that we pleased, and we would ruin ourselves without many scruples, because there's nothing that would actually stop us from, you know, destroying ourselves in any number of very, very profound and abysmal ways. So Christianity has always regarded these things as ways of growing, ways of developing our souls, ways of becoming spiritually closer to God, ways of opening our eyes and clarifying our vision. One of the great shifts that's happened in recent times, particularly, is that particular view of suffering has become, I won't say that it's been eliminated, but it has certainly been laid aside, it's been obscured. And this is owing to a great many things. Science permits us to ignore these problems to a great extent, because it allows us to avoid much of the suffering that was simply common to our race before the advent of modern technology. It allows us to hide things like death. We don't have to deal with people dying in our households anymore. We can outsource all of that. We can give that over to the hospitals and the doctors, and we don't have to actually look that in the eye any longer. We're able much more effectively to ignore our position and our situation in the world. Philosophically, I think this happens with Nietzsche, because Nietzsche found a way. I mean, he almost discovered this way of actually looking at suffering as a boon without looking at it as a way of spiritual growth, right? He found a way of transforming suffering through this idea of the will to power, through this idea of self overcoming, into a means of uh, ostensible self improvement, right? Self betterment, self growth. And in so doing, he actually eliminated the connection between suffering and death and God in a certain way, or at least he obscured that connection to the point that one is capable now of looking at those matters without having recourse to redemption or salvation or damnation or any of these old concepts. And that seems to me a very, very striking element to our modern situation, because now we're in a position where we can go through life experiences like that you described in your own life, things that I've gone through a great many very difficult times as well, which have enabled me to see the world with greater clarity and have enabled me to move toward God. But it would have been possible for me to interpret those things in a kind of Nietzschean lens and philosophically as a way of, you know, propelling myself toward a greater levels of power. So that seems to have have disconnected us fundamentally from something important in our humanity.
I should think so. I think that word specifically, disconnect, probably, I think best conceptualizes where the hangup might be when you speak on the modern meaning crisis. If I were to give my own personal takes on the sort of will to power, I think might have some utility in the short term, right? Like if you have a lot of angst and you feel a disconnect and your suffering doesn't have any meaning, because that's essentially what happens in a world in which there's a quote like death of God. If there is no greater purpose, then you can't explain away the existence of your suffering because it's there hitting you on the face, but you don't have any answers for it. You're just told you have to create your own answers and your own meaning, but that's essentially an exercise in futility, because you recognize that whatever meaning you're creating is still just subjective and doesn't hold any real weight. So and that disconnect also sort of leads back into that lack of peace. So I would say the utility in the short term comes from the fact of I can see how someone could be inspired of, okay, like life is suffering, life is very hard, and I only have so much time here on this rock floating in space, but I can, it's sort of like a very like masculine centric, pull yourself by the bootstraps philosophy of I'm going to overcome this, I'm going to make the most of this, and I'm going to flourish and assert my power. And as I do this, this will transform my suffering into a virtue. And so, in a sense, it's almost like there's a like in an embezzled Christianity ethic insofar as we're gonna take the suffering and use it to our own benefit. To your point there, it's funny that in my opinion, a lot of like modern post-Cartesian philosophers are often like operating within the husks of the carcass of Christianity. But so my own takes, anyways. And I would say, again, bringing it back to where I see the sort of shortcomings in embracing a will to power, though, is that it's not something that can sustain you in the long term. Um, just because, again, if you're operating off of your own intellect and your own willpower, you're not able to. If you're trying to fight the forces of the world and the forces of fate by yourself, you're going to burn out. You're not going to win. Um, and I think just anecdotally, one of the best proofs of this is just if you look at anyone who is genuinely joyous or um, happy, they there's not a lot of either strong or joyous or genuinely happy people I know of who say that Nietzschean philosophy is the undergirding philosophy that guides them through life. Um, and again, like I don't mean that to be like facetious, but this sort of goes back to again, philosophy is self-confession, and if you want to see the utility of a philosophy, look at the fruits of its labor. What does the someone who embodies this philosophy? What do they look like? Uh, and so um, that's that's essentially how I sort of see the modern crisis today, though, is that everyone still operates with this implicit assumption about God is dead and what do we do with it. And thus, very few people might actually read Nietzsche today, but everyone is still, in one form or another, operating off of his sort of modus operandi. And that's why, especially when you see it the younger sort of generations, millennial, and then especially Gen Z and Gen Alpha, who I've sometimes come across in my professional career, you see a lot of that going rampant, and you see a lot of mental instability, to say the least. So,
Definitely, yeah. Embezzled Christianity. That was beautifully put. I like that very much. There is so much of that in modern philosophy, and I think that that's because modern philosophy is necessarily reactive, right? It's reacting to what came before. It does not have any kind of autonomous existence, or the autonomous existence that it does have is always a reflection of what it's responding to. It has to adopt these things. It has to absorb these elements of the prior tradition because otherwise it just leaves an enormous void in people. And it ends up leaving a void anyway, but it's a void that's very carefully covered up by any number of different, very pleasant masks and things like that. At least when you're reading these people, that's the impression that you get. Although I agree with you that in practice, the results are very different. And that's part of the reason that it's so interesting to look at the artistic representations of this kind of philosophy in individuals like Dostoevsky. There are other authors as well who treat of these issues in a very, very effective way. So, I mean, I think that there are a number of other ways in which one could connect Nietzsche to our modern plight in this particular aspect of our situation. I think that his attempt to deal with the mortality of human beings was probably came through his ideas of amor fati and then also the eternal return because this is his way of trying to again smuggle or embezzle you know immortality, a kind of Christian immortality, into a very, very secular philosophy. The degree to which that was actually successful, of course, is entirely debatable, and the degree to which it actually informs our thought is kind of tenuous and difficult to bring out. But I do think that the influence that he's had has definitely been in the direction of in, increasing our level of blindness to our own situation, and increasing our level of blindness in a way in which we're able to become very excited about our situation in the world because Nietzsche is very exciting, right? He's very engaging. When you read him, he really just carries you away. And these ideas have that kind of an effect. They've got a very tonic effect on the mind and on the soul. So we find ourselves in this situation where we've had meaning pretty much stolen out from underneath us. Like the meaning that embodied our lives before, it was embedded in our lives before, through Christianity, through our traditions, through our culture, is now being stripped away layer by layer to the point where it just doesn't exist any longer. And it's not entirely clear what's supposed to fill that void. Even according to some of the real progressive thinkers of our time, what exactly is it that they think is going to supplant that missing meaning? And I think that many of us are living in the crisis of this, trying to understand how to exist in our lives according to modern standards and modern presuppositions, but without having any way of actually addressing the fundamental need that we all have for a meaning which transcends our lives here on earth, for a meaning which is greater than ourselves. This is another thing that you speak to in your videos. I'd very much like to have your thoughts on this, about this crisis of meaning that's kind of at the root and the core of everything we've been discussing.
yeah, I would say, again, what we are seeing more and more paramount is essentially just moral relativism, right? The notion that there is no such thing as true morality, what we were discussing at the beginning of the video, truth, beauty, and goodness, those have been subverted from, instead of the North Stars that should guide our life, it's essentially been subverted that the modern ethos says these are just constructs. Truth is only subjective to, I have my truth, you have your truth. None of this is actually real. There is no such thing as implicit or real goodness. And this is a quick way to lead a life of agony real quick because we do have a genuine need for meaning, and it's not grounded in something subjective. Like we objectively are teleological human beings who have a purpose to serve. Uh, and this isn't even necessarily a religious argument. This is Aristotle and Plato even. Happiness is action in accordance with virtue, I believe Aristotle wrote in his Ethics. The notion being is that what we're sort of robbed of, both in our modern education especially, and then more in society at large, sadly, each and every day, is the notion that we do have a duty and moral obligation to reach our potential, to essentially seek virtue and to become all that we can be, not just to know ourselves, but so that we can be beacons of goodness to the world around us and spread joy. I think this is a big part of why Jordan Peterson took off, what was it, like 7 to 10 years ago now at this point, is because he spoke so much to that notion to young men about, like, hey, you have an obligation, clean your room, like, get your life in order, and then watch what happens as you getting yourself together ripples out. So you begin to realize that again, one of the best ways to realize that there's a sense of objectivity behind this is one, you can first point out the universality of suffering, that everyone is unhappy and in despair about the fact that their life is meaningless when you sort of imbibe this moral relativism. It's my life is without meaning and nothing matters. But then why does this universally depress all of us, and why do we all act as if everything matters severely? If you want to see your beliefs, see how people act, and everyone acts as if things are a matter of life or death. Just look at the political state. You realize people are a walking contradiction, and again, you can't explain away your pain. There is an objective need to have truth in our lives. So I'd say the very first task, as far as I can see, that comes to solving the meaning crisis of modern man is being able to effectively articulate at the level of culture that these things do exist. Truth, beauty, and goodness do exist objectively, and you have an obligation to go out there and pursue these things and reach your full potential and flourish and then spread that goodness around you. How you actually go about doing that is probably the great challenge and question of our times, but that is the rational sort of answer to the problem.
Definitely, definitely. And it's very comforting to me because I see movement being made in this direction. Particularly, I think in the past 5 years or so, there's been a definite change, I think, in the public discourse, particularly online. And we're seeing a lot more attempts being made to actually try to reclaim some of these old ideas. Now, these attempts necessarily are clumsy, and many times they just kind of fall to pieces around very silly issues, or they focus on things that are of secondary importance, or they in their attempts to regain some kind of a past ideal, they end up settling on caricatures of what that ideal actually was. This happens a lot with Stoicism. This happens a lot with ideas of manliness in particular, like the entire manosphere is kind of like, well, how do we reclaim masculinity? Let's just set up Arnold Schwarzenegger as the ideal, and then we'll go with it, right? Or something like this, and it doesn't quite it misses some of the fundamental points there. So it's like in responding to the crisis of meaning, which was a response to the prior tradition, it's like every step of the way, there's something that gets gained and something that gets lost. And the things that get gained are always less important than the things that get lost. So we're in this state where we're kind of completely hollowed out, and we're striving desperately, at least many of us are striving desperately to try to regain that thing that was taken from us, that was lost at some point in the not so distant past, and we're not quite sure how to get there. Right? Our attempts are very clumsy; they're very ham-handed, and we're attempting to regain even a kind of a philosophical idea as you propose. Right? It doesn't necessarily have to be religious, although I think religion certainly helps. But even to regain that kind of old philosophical position, but without having any of the tools necessary to do so, because in the meantime, our education systems have gone down the sinkhole. We don't have the training in simple philosophical reasoning that was once fairly commonplace to anyone with an education. We've even, in some cases, been educated to, in a certain way, distrust our reason, to distrust the ability of our reason to come to any kind of conclusions, and to focus much more on our feelings and on our instincts rather than on our way of thinking. Which, again, for good and for bad, but in this case, more for bad, I think, because it disallows us from being able to move very fluidly, or to act very, capably in these kinds of philosophical spheres. So we're kind of groping in the dark here, right? It's a very, very difficult, very, very difficult for us to try to find our way through this forest. Now, I wonder if there's a way in which we might be able to reclaim some of these modern movements, and maybe even in a certain sense, a kind of, very limited Nietzscheanism, insofar as the actual attempt that we have to make to try to reclaim virtue and meaning and goodness and beauty in our lives might itself be the path to reclaiming these things, insofar as the struggle that confronts us, the difficulties that we face, the challenges that we have to overcome, become in a way a means of, strengthening ourselves and becoming more capable in these regards, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I can say I'd also love to hear your thoughts as far as how one might go about doing this on the more macro level, as far as trying to organize, whether this is at the level of institutions or organizations, or trying to reorient an entire culture. But at least starting from the level of the individual, where I always feel most comfortable starting is I always think it's great to start with yourself, and you hate to start with cliches like "be the change you want to see in the world." But I mean, so in one extent, like you do determine your reality, right? I believe it was Augustine who said that there's no such thing as good or bad times. If you lead a good life, then you live in good times, even the world's going to crap, right? Um, and so, as far as how you can begin by starting to orient yourself in the right way, and maybe reject modernity, but also avoid being reactionary, such that you're just part of, I'd say, like either the red pill or the manosphere, or something that is maybe well intentioned but missing the mark. Uh, I think a lot of this just goes to, for one, understanding your story. Like the Western canon exists, and there is a story that is pervading throughout our history for the past 2,000 some years and continuously counting. And so, for one, just again, giving yourself the education that you've been denied is a fantastic way to start. Whether this is learning history, reading great literature, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, um, just like all of the greats, uh, and then being able to understand history, understand the great thinkers, the great philosophers. I'm particularly a big fan of the three big Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. The medieval philosophers are great for sort of synthesizing Greek emphasis on reason and the logos with Christian revelation. And of course, reading the Bible, I always recommend, even if you're not a believer, just because the Bible is probably the most singular book that's transformed the entire West, if not the world. And so, if nothing else, it's a portal of self knowledge to understanding our culture and understanding yourself, because you've likely imbibed some of those beliefs without realizing it. So, as you understand this knowledge of self and this sort of greater meta narrative, and I can speak personally after having done this for 10 years, on the personal level, you begin to get this sense of conviction of not only right and wrong, but also what is true. And this sort of, as you begin to walk closer and closer with truth, you have this sort of transformation insofar as you begin to realize that more of these virtues tend to filter into your life, insofar as like having a sense of courage, a sense of conviction, a sense of control. I used to be a remarkably timid person, but I'm just always afraid to offend people, because what are we always told? Like, be unquestionably tolerant, don't offend anyone, don't hurt people's feelings. And I'm super agreeable, so I hate conflict. But as you begin to sort of walk in line with what is true, you get emboldened in ways that surprise you. And as I've luckily found more and more in my personal life, is as I've continued to be set in my convictions and in my ways, people around me, without giving too many examples, have actually become curious, like, why are you doing these things? Someone saw me writing down scripture at work once, and she's not particularly religious at all, and has often said disparaging things about it. But when she saw me writing down a verse to myself, she was like genuinely curious, and was like, wait, why are you doing this? And then like a big conversation followed, and who knows where that might take. These things happen more and more, and so as you begin to transform yourself and walk in accordance with this truth, you begin to realize that you inadvertently start to have an impact on the world around you. And so That's always where I recommend, because one, that will at the very least transform your life in a positive way, and there's no telling how that might ripple out as you begin to impact others. From there, you can do classical things like maybe starting a good family. They say the family is the bedrock institution of what makes a society, and that's another institution that is tragically under attack. But if you have a great family, that you have children that are coming in, and that you can train them and help with the next generation. But this also makes you part of it, more involved in your active and local community. And you get what I'm saying. Like, it starts to transcend up from there, but it always starts with yourself. And to me, it always begins with taking that duty and recognizing that obligation to understand your history, your story, and your culture's narrative, and realizing that you're part of that narrative and you are part of a larger story, and therefore you have a role to play. And once you play that role in that story well, that's what leads you to a happy and meaningful life, and that's how you can start to set the world back in order, or at least make it a little less chaotic.
That's great stuff. Really, really great stuff. And there's, I mean, it's fundamental. It's fundamental. For a very long time in my life, I was quite the revolutionary, and I was very interested in attempting to transform things on the political scale because I felt that that was the only way that we would attain the wide effects that are needed in order to turn this ship around. And it was very beneficial to me because it enabled me to understand the political situation of our times. I dedicated myself to that for many years, and to attempting to understand the philosophical roots of our political situation and the way that politics are actually carried out in reality, as opposed to the way it's kind of presented to us on the many screens that we have in our lives and the sort of image that's given to us. But it became abundantly clear to me over years of actually attempting to work through these problems and attempting to imagine what a political change would actually look like. That the only way a political change could have any force or effect is if there is a prior change on the level of the individual. That the individual is always the fundamental unit in any kind of wider movement. And if you're trying to perform a political change with a bunch of individuals who are unprepared for it or rotten to the core, you're going to end up with a disaster. We've seen this so many times in the past 100 years that it's rather naive of us to think anything different could come from a new revolution or something of the sort. So I think that you're focusing on very immediate, practical questions is actually the key to this entire conundrum. And I think that the specific advice that you gave is excellent. Read good books, start a family, focus on your personal virtue. Or these are things that can actually have a real effect in the world, and they can have a tangible effect in the world. Whereas going online and ranting against the political situation is not liable to have much of a tangible effect, and is certainly not liable to result in any kind of you know very beneficial consequences for anybody. We're tasked in a certain sense with supplying the lack in our own educations. We have to kind of train ourselves to philosophize. We have to train ourselves to read, even because there's this myth of universal literacy nowadays, just because everybody knows how to, read words on a page. But the old idea of reading is very different from the new idea of reading. The old idea of reading actually entails profundity as well as just being able to go over the surface of the page, right? You have to actually dig into these words and understand the meaning behind them. And this has been true ever since the first words were put to page in our Western history. So we actually really have to rediscover the art of reading. And the only way that you can do that is by reading the right kinds of books. Most of the books that are published today are not the right kinds of books. There are some, but they're few and far between and difficult to find. They should be looked for, but a sure bet is to go back and read the classics. And the classics have always been regarded as classics for a reason, because of their profundity, because of their depth. They give us the ability to actually set ourselves through a kind of training of the mind, of the soul. We have this very academic view of reading, I think, which is very problematic. It's very dangerous as well because it compels us to regard reading as a sort of pastime or an activity which is done sort of passively. Um, when in fact, the classical idea of reading was actually a way of conversing with the author, right? You were actually, in a certain sense, putting your own ideas on the tribunal stand, right? And analyzing them, considering them very profoundly. It wasn't just an act of trying to understand what the other person was saying. It was an act of trying to understand what you believe and why and whether you should, right? So it's a transformative act. Reading is a transformative act. And if we can regain that, that's already a great step forward because that gives us a tool which is at our immediate disposal, particularly given the wide accessibility of literature in our day, which is unprecedented in history. We can access the classics at the click of a button. All of us can read any book that was published, certainly before 1950, for free without any trouble in our language. Right? This has never happened before in the history of the world, everyone. So, but of course, we don't really put that to good service. And I think part of the problem is that we're living in a world which is filled with all of these devices, which are, you know, designed to distract us. And so the very things that give us the power to escape our situation are acting as kind of active obstructions to our escaping our situation. So there's this kind of a dynamic at play as well.
I think one thing, and this is even almost a comical full circle moment as far as reading goes and its relation to power, is that you see a lot of this Nietzschean, but I'd say more postmodern perversion of reading into a denigration of mere power. And within postmodernism is critical theory, which is what I was was being taught when I went through university studying literature. And critical theory, for anyone unfamiliar, is essentially it's just about deconstruction. It has this presupposition that there's no objective truth that can be discerned from literature, and instead all that's happening is that there's power structures embedded within the story, and we have to interpret them to deconstruct them to understand what pernicious power games are being played. And so what that would mean in a more practical sense is, say, we might read a classic like Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, dystopian novel, right? And instead of having commentary on, maybe instead of any like deeply political commentary or anything that might sort of ascertain to morality and questions of justice, the questions would be, where is there sexism in this story? Why is Huxley racist for writing this?
Why are the Native Americans the ones who are on a camp in the middle of the desert?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So, all that university was teaching you how to do is assume that everything is about power, and therefore you need to assert power by deconstructing and making these just defamatory claims about these people, making absurd accusations, giving them any ism under the book, sexist, racist, whatever. And so this was something that I don't know why, just to me, it always struck me as nonsense, even as a 19-year-old when I didn't quite have a grasp on everything. I'm like, no, this can't just be, like, there's more going on here than just this. But I would just see a lot of my contemporaries over the years, the more that they were embedded and imbibed into this sort of critical theory mindset, the more that you would just see them sadly become like enraged, and you would just begin to see that they would begin to look at the world through the lens of power. Just everything is evil, and we're going to deconstruct everything as far as I see it, and then we're going to try to reconstruct reality as I personally see fit. So a bit more of an explanation into where the will to power comes short in modernity. But back to what you were originally saying, reading at its best is when you're just, I loved what you said, like just having a conversation. Like when you are having a conversation with a brilliant mind, like it teaches you to think. Once you can read and be able to write down and understand either the argument that is being made, or just be able to write and explain what a story is about and articulate it in your own words, you've now had a very rich conversation about wisdom and just general life truths from one of the greatest minds to exist. And as you begin to understand it and explain it to yourself and be able to articulate it, now you're making yourself remarkably powerful, because now you're able to better speak about what is true in reality. So it helps you get closer aligned to reality, and therefore by extension makes you more joyous. And now you're actually more equipped to speak on what is true to everyone else, such that you can bring them in. Oftentimes the best way to make someone fall in love with literature is to just show how passionate you are about it and how much you love it. And this is where literature and reading becomes its most empowering, is when you realize that you're here not to break down, but to humble yourself and learn such that you can build and look upwards. And that's the key distinction that is missing today, sadly.
Yes. Yes, that passion is so contagious and so important, and that's one of the things that I really want to compliment you on, Sean, because you transmit that in your videos, your passion for the things that you're reading and the things you're discussing, and that's a great gift that you give to your viewers. Because I think that returning to where we began with this conversation about some of the philosophical transformations that happened in modernity. One of the worst of them, I think, is the idea of the historical consciousness, the idea that we are historically privileged and that we have an ability to understand the past better than the past understood itself. We can look back on past times and we can see the ways in which they were limited. We can see all the ways in which they were prejudiced and the ways in which they could not perceive the truth because we have a vantage that they lacked. Now, a lot of this is owed to Nietzsche. It's something that predated him because this goes all the way back to the Enlightenment and even the Renaissance and their particular take on medieval Christianity and their attempt to kind of downplay medieval Christianity and the achievements of medieval Christianity in order to show their own achievements in greater splendor. But it's something that's characterized our entire modernity, and it's something that very much characterizes our present moment as well. All of us, I think, fall prey to this in to one extent or another. When we look at the past, we have a very definite tendency to think that we've moved beyond the past. The people who lived in the past were limited in any number of ways. And as a consequence of that, we don't really have to take them seriously. But the precondition to reading a book is that you are open to the possibility that it is true. If you do not have that, if you do not have that precondition, you do not have that understanding that it might have something real to teach you, you'll never take it seriously. It will be at best a pastime, a diversion, and probably not even that, because you're going to certainly be looking for things that are a little more entertaining than some of the old books that were written, 500 years ago. You're going to be looking for the newest stuff. So you've got to come to this literature with the awareness that these people might actually have a view of the world that transcends our own. And what's interesting is that we're all kind of subject to this blindness by which we're not able to see the ways in which it actually does. When you break through that and you're actually able to sit down with one of these books seriously and really start to read it, suddenly it opens worlds. It opens worlds to you. I mean, I remember my relationship to Plato was very much like this. I went to Plato thinking that Plato has these dialogues in which Socrates makes these ridiculous arguments. They're just silly, silly arguments. They are manifestly false and they are transparently false. And I as a teenager could see how false they were. So my understanding was, okay, well, Plato evidently thought like a child. He lived a long, long time ago. He really doesn't, maybe there's something in there that's worth finding, but it would be much more sensible for me to read modern books where I've got people who are, thinking on my own level and just leave the children to their stuff. And, maybe antiquarians can go read Plato. And it was Plato himself who actually broke me free of this because in one of his dialogues, he completely deconstructs the process of writing books, right? He actually critiques writing as an activity and points out all the ways in which a philosopher should not be writing. But this isn't a written work. So obviously there's something else going on here, right? Plato taught me how to read Plato. And as soon as I was able to break through the illusion that Plato was really holding to these childish arguments, suddenly that opened up the possibility that Plato is a depth that I was simply not comprehending. And at that point, you start to actually read them, right? You start to read these old authors and you start to see the ways in which they're pointing you to different kinds of truths, to pointing you to different kinds of ways of viewing things that you're never going to be able to get at if you consider them to be children. So I think that really one of the first things we have to actually really deconstruct. So again, let's take deconstruction and use it appropriately against ourselves. We have to deconstruct our historical sense, our idea that we are historically privileged, because we're not. We're subject to any number of prejudices and errors all our own. And the only way of us breaking free of that is by looking at people who did not suffer from those same prejudices, which is to say, the great minds of the past. Right? So we have to go to them with an openness that allows for this kind of transformation that we're discussing. And that's another way in which we can educate ourselves, I think, very directly and immediately with materials that we all have on hand.
Absolutely. What I think the one word that's really like striking to me out of what you just beautifully articulated is humility. Like, because I had a very similar experience to you insofar as I looked at the past as largely antiquated. There's a great term I heard speaking of this. I think historical chauvinism, the idea of like just because we're later, we're better, and everyone else was stupid and knew nothing. And funny enough, it was also for me Plato who really like shook my world once I realized like this man who was 2,500 years behind me could understand and speak to my human experience, but also understand it better. And I mean, they said Socrates was the wisest because he knew that he knew nothing at all. And I think that's really the largest problem that I see, especially again in many of my dialogues that I'll have with a lot more of the younger, like Gen Zers, who I think are great representatives of modernity, is, in addition to millennials, is that there's um, sorry, there's like a lack of awareness of how little we actually know. Um, and really, that's just a never-ending rabbit hole, honestly. Like, as soon as you think that you know that, I tend to find that I personally like am missing the mark again. Because, as soon as you, and that's the beauty of reading, is that it's this never-ending cycle of the more you read great books, the more you learn, but then the more you realize like just how ignorant you are, how much more there is to go. And so that's reading at its best. And I think it might be a posture that helps breed more humility and might give you a better spiritual alignment in terms of how you should have a relationship with reality, is realizing like I know so much little and therefore there are so many mistakes that I could be making, and there are, both on the personal and on the more like macro collective level, there are ways that I could be screwing things up. And let me just try to seek to lessen my ignorance each and every day. Let me try to be a bit more humbler. Let me try to be a bit less dogmatic and a bit more open to seeking that which is genuinely true. So it's not that it's just a matter of knowledge acquisition or giving you power, which it absolutely can. But there is something curative about the contemplative life in and of itself. Like there is something that is in and of its an end in and of itself, insofar as just bringing you to rest by humbling you and helping you realize just how much greater, like honestly, the cosmos is. The more that you get sort of wowed by the experience of truth, and the less that you know, and the greater that you begin to see the universe as it is, the more you begin to fall in love with the universe. You feel insignificant in a beautiful way. Just this sort of like, I know nothing, but everything above me is just so vivacious and so filled with life and so infinite compared to my completely finite sense of rationality and intellectual capabilities. And that is honestly quite beautiful. It's like death of self in the best way, like a sort of voluntarily like voluntarily joyous death of your ego as you sort of submit to the greater truth beyond you. And that's really the sort of the curative posture that helps. Um, I'd say that is the answer to the meaning crisis. So not necessarily attachment to one dogma, but just learning to realize like life is inherently good and I am inherently significant in relation to it. Or that's my argument, anyways.
I mean, to quote Plato's Socrates as well, philosophy is a preparation for death. Philosophy is
Yep.
a preparation for dying, right? And that I never, strangely enough, I'd never made the connection between that and humility, but there is an evident and obvious connection there to be made. And I think that ties in very nicely as well to where we started with all of this, with you contrasting Raskolnikov and Nietzsche by saying that Raskolnikov had something that Nietzsche didn't, namely humility.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about modernity which eschews humility, which insists upon arrogance in a very hubristic kind of
Mm-hmm.
way, and a very, very hazardous kind of way. So I think that might actually be a nice place to wrap this up then, Sean. That's a good way of turning us right back to the beginning to where we started. And this has been a delightful conversation, though. Thank you so much for joining me for this. I feel like we could spend an hour just on the question of humility and death and how those two things are related in a philosophical sense. But we've definitely covered a lot of ground here. And if you'd like to come on again and talk to me about some of these subjects, I would be more than happy to have you.
Anytime. Yeah, this was a fantastic conversation, and thanks for inviting me on your show. Yeah, this was truly a delightful and joyous way to start off this morning here. So I agree with you. I feel like we really only just hit the tip of the iceberg in this hour, and I'd absolutely love to come back on anytime for more conversations.
I'll look forward to that then. Sean, before we close, would you like to tell everyone where they can find you, what you're working on at present, anything along those lines?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, honestly, the simplest thing right now is you can just follow me on either YouTube or X. For the time being, YouTube is where I do have more of a larger corpus of work and a bit more long form, but I am more active on X at the moment. You can find both of those. My Twitter handle is Sean Berube4. YouTube, you can find me by just typing into the search bar Sean Berube. That's SeanBerube. And yeah, you can just follow me on either of those platforms if you'd like to hear more ideas like this.
Excellent. All right. And I'll have links to all of that as well in the description when I upload this video. So by all means, check out Sean's work. And again, his videos are highly, highly recommended. It's very, very good stuff. They're very short videos, very contained videos that have a wealth of information, and they take you through some very, very interesting characters and very interesting ideas. So by all means, check that out. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us today. This has been a very good conversation once again, and I'll look forward to the future conversations with you, Sean. So thanks so much to all of you, and until next time, farewell.